And welcome back to another podcast with Mr. Hagan. And on this podcast, we're going to continue talking about the Federal Reserve Bank. And the Federal Reserve Bank has two main jobs. We're going to talk about one of them on this video, and that is their job. One of their jobs is to regulate the banking system, to regulate banks, and this is done through a lot of this is carried out. A lot of the work of regulating the banks is carried out by the regional Federal Reserve banks. I had talked about that on a previous video. So let me just go back and look at it real fast. Here are all the regional banks. It's broken down into 12 regions, and each of these banks, each of these regions, they carry out a lot of the Fed policy. San Francisco, Kansas City, Dallas, Philadelphia, New York, etc. And so they're going to carry out a lot of the Federal Reserve policy. Now, the Federal Reserve, as a regulator of the banks, it acts as a banker's bank. So what banks have to do is they have to put money on deposit with the Federal Reserve, and I'll talk about that in detail here a little bit later. And part of being the banker's bank allows them to act as a lender of last resort, which means one of their goals is going to be to prevent bank failures. And we could debate whether or not they're effective at this, but that's what they're supposed to do. And so let's kind of talk about what a bank failure looks like, and then we'll tie in how the Federal Reserve tries to prevent these, and we'll tie it into kind of what their job is here with managing the banking system. So let's imagine we just have some bank in some little town, call it Bank A, whatever, and in that town you have a bunch of people in that town, and they have a job, working somewhere, and when they get paid, they earn a paycheck, and then they put their paycheck into the bank, and so all these guys are putting their money into the bank, and maybe the bank, as a result of this, maybe the bank has $1 million of deposits from all these people that have put money into the bank. Now, the bank doesn't just take this $1 million and just put it in the vault and lock it shut. They're going to take that $1 million and they're going to lend it out to other people. So now the bank's going to take a lot of that $1 million, and they're going to lend it out to a farmer. Maybe there's some small business they're going to lend it to. They might lend it out to somebody to buy a house. All these different things. So we have $1 million came in, and let's say they lend out $900,000 of that is going to get lent out to these people. Now, here's the problem. That means that the bank, at any one time, on any one day, has about $100,000 in the bank that it uses to carry out its daily transactions. So that means, and usually that's fine, because this guy comes and he deposits another 100, and this guy, he writes a check for 300, and this guy deposits 400, and this guy withdraws 2,000, and money's flowing in and out all the time. But this $100,000 is enough to manage all of those daily inflows and outflows. So there's not really a problem, except under extreme conditions, like these things that I said, bank runs. So, if the rumor starts to spread that Bank A is out of money, maybe people from another town had a bank collapse and the neighboring town, and so now people start worrying that their bank's going to collapse and run out of money, or however this gets started, now all of a sudden these guys, they want to get their money out before, the bank runs out of money. So they hear that Bank A is out of money, and it kind of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, because now this guy goes to the bank and he withdraws his money because he wants to make sure that he gets his money before the bank fails. And then this guy hears that and he says, "Oh, I better get my money," and so he withdraws his money, and this guy withdraws his money, and all of a sudden everybody's withdrawing their money, and the problem is that the bank is it doesn't have that full $1 million on any one given day. It only has the $100,000. So if there's a run on the bank, the run literally means that everybody tries to withdraw their money at one time, and they can't do it. The bank's only got $100,000, and so the bank is going to run out of money, and now it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The bank doesn't have money, everybody takes their money out, and the bank really doesn't have the money. It doesn't have the money to cover it. Now, Bank A could go try to borrow money from Bank B. They could, other ways that they could try to go get money. But if they don't, then the bank's going to fail. It's going to go under. And it might be a perfectly good bank. It's servicing the customers. It's carrying these loans. It's lending money to people. Its assets are greater than its liabilities. It's not a bad bank. But the run on the bank causes the bank to go under because they don't have more than that $100,000. They don't have the whole $1 million in deposits at any one time in the bank, because it's lent out to these guys. And here's the other part of this problem is these guys can come get their money out anytime they want, but these loans are typically very long, 5 years, 10 years, sometimes 30 years. And so the problem is that their assets are long-term, but their liabilities are very short-term. They have to be able to meet them immediately. So this would happen in the past. Banks would go under. People would lose their money. All these kind of terrible things. And so part of the job of the Federal Reserve was to try to end these bank runs. So here's how it might happen now. Under the Federal Reserve System, we now have these 4 banks. Let's say Bank A, Bank B, Bank C, Bank D, and each of these banks gets $1 million in deposit, just like my example up here. Each of these banks gets $1 million in deposit. And when they get the $1 million in deposit, the $1 million comes in, the first thing the bank has to do is they have to send part of that money to the Federal Reserve. So this is the Federal Reserve. They have to send part of that money to the banker's bank, to the Federal Reserve. So Bank A sends $100,000 to the Federal Reserve. Bank B sends $100,000 to the Federal Reserve. Bank C and Bank D, they all send $100,000 to the Federal Reserve. So Bank A is now left with $900,000 that it can use to lend out to other people, carry out daily transactions, things like that. Bank B has $900,000, C and D. So maybe Bank A would lend $800,000 out to other people, and then it would have $100,000 left to do its everyday transactions. Now, here's what's important. If there's a run on Bank A, if all of a sudden everybody wants to take their money out at once and A doesn't have enough money to handle that, what can they do? They can borrow money from the Federal Reserve. They go to the Federal Reserve can lend them some money, and then when people come to the bank, then we get this guy comes to the bank and he says, I want my money, right? Well, they have his money. They can give it to him. They borrowed it from the Federal Reserve. Another guy comes to the bank and he says, hey, I heard the bank's out of money. I want my money. And the bank can give him his money. And then another guy shows up and he says, I also heard it's out of money. Give me my money. And the bank can give him his money. And so what's important here is it restores confidence. The $400,000 that the Fed has, they can lend it to Bank A, and Bank A can use it to meet their withdrawals, to give people their money back, and then these guys all say, oh, well, I guess the bank does have money, and their confidence is restored, and they put their money back into the bank, and then Bank A sends it back to the Federal Reserve, and then if there's a run on Bank C, the Federal Reserve can lend the money to Bank C, and then Bank C can pay them back afterwards. So all of this then would theoretically prevent bank runs, because people would they'd know their bank is safe, and if they ever thought it wasn't and there was a run on the bank would come to an end, because the Federal Reserve would be able to provide the funding to each of these banks to get them through any run on the bank. So that's kind of the idea. One of the big jobs of the Federal Reserve is to try to prevent these bank runs. All right, this has been Mr. Hagan on another podcast. Thanks for joining me. On the next podcast, we'll talk about the Federal Reserve's second job, which is managing the money supply. This has been Mr. Hagan on another podcast. Thanks for joining me, and we'll see you on the next podcast.